Good afternoon, teachers, students, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Mama Charitable Foundation Visiting Professor in Buddhist Studies Lecture Series 2013 to 14. This time, we are very honored and glad to have Professor Lewis Lancaster to be the Mama Charitable Foundation Visiting Professor in Buddhist Studies this time. In the coming 3 weeks, Professor Lancaster will present different topics and share his wisdom in Buddhist Studies with us. To begin with, I'd like to invite Wenbo Hin Hong, Director of our Center, to give an introduction of Professor Lancaster. Wenbo Hin Hong, please.
Mr. Langachai, our distinguished Professor Karunadasa, Professor Louis Lancaster, and honorable guests. Welcome to the second lecture series organized under the Mama Charitable Foundation Visitor Professorships in Buddhist Studies. Last year, the Mama Charitable Foundations make a very generous donations of 10 million Hong Kong dollar for us to establish a permanent endowment to support the appointment of visiting scholars of top distinctions. The Mama Charitable Foundation was established in memory of Mrs. Leung, the mother of Mr. Leung Ka-chai and Mr. Leung Ka-tai. Mrs. Leung was a devoted Buddhist, and the Dharma name that was given to her by her Buddhist master was Guangjing and Samyim, which is now the Chinese name of the foundation, Guangjing Samyim Qixin Geigam. As you may know, during the last academic year, the Professor Karunadasa was our last visiting professor under this visiting professorships. For the current academic years, we are most honored to have appointed Professor Louis Lancaster for the post. Professor Lancaster is a well-respected scholar in the field of Buddhist studies. You can say that he actually witnessed the introduction of Buddhism into America. He was one of the ones that persuaded the University of Berkeley to start a PhD program on Buddhist studies, a program that he directed for more than 30 years. Following his retirement from Berkeley, he served as the president of the University of the West in Los Angeles and is currently a research professor there. One of his research interests is to incorporate digital technology into Buddhist studies. He was one of the first people to try to organize, or he's tried to digitalize the Buddhist canon. He is currently trying to construct an electronic atlas of maritime Buddhism. That is trying to find all the dots, all the places that is important of how Buddhism go from India through all the seaports and then into China. And by doing so, he's trying to prove that this Pearl area, Pearl River Delta is an important site of how Buddhism went through to get into China. And the professor is still looking for funding for this. And by doing so, aside from his academic and scholarly works, Professor Lancaster also teaches Buddhism to prisoners in California. And I think he enjoyed doing that more than doing his other researches. So without further delay, may I now invite Professor Lancaster to give his lectures on today's topic, Buddhism, bioethics, and the concept of body. Professor Lancaster.
Thank you very much, Honorable Hin Hong. And thank you, Mr. Leung, for being such a good sponsor for this professorship and for the work of the center. We really appreciate it. Nice to see all of you. Thank you for coming on this Saturday afternoon. I always enjoy speaking to you, so it's a great pleasure to be back and to see so many familiar faces as well as new ones. I play around with a lot of these ideas, and I have to admit that it's kind of play. I don't stand here as a great proficient in biology or even in ethics, but I enjoy trying to deal with the issues that are contained in the topic. So I'm going to leave some time for us to have discussion, and I really would love to have your comments or your questions. It helps me a lot to have them. One of the issues that I'm trying to address is the relevance of Buddhism in today's world. It's my belief that no religion today can really be relevant without coming to grips with some of the enormous changes that are sweeping over our societies. And that we have to figure out how can our ethical and moral systems give us any help as we address changes which affect all of our lives at very basic levels. A lot of people, I have quite a few who say, I should just not do it because Buddhism and science are two different things. And of course they are. But at the same time, if Buddhism cannot have anything to say with regard to science, then it will become irrelevant. I've been very interested that just this last week, the Dalai Lama has said to a lot of his top monks, you must become scientists. You, as good monks within our tradition, have to also be trained in science, because Buddhism must address the issues of science. And I want some of you who work with me to be able to talk about science in a very informed and with great expertise. That's a great step for a Buddhist leader to take, I think. But I believe it's an important one, and I look forward to seeing what's going to happen with that. For the whole time that I've been studying Buddhism, and as you hear and look at me, you know it's been a long time, one thing that always keeps in my mind is, how in the world was it that a young man in the rainforest of India 2,500 years ago made teaching which is still being promulgated today? When you think about it, that was a cultural issue of rainforest. It was in many ways remote from lots of the rest of the world, and yet it happened. So I'm always looking for trying to understand that. In terms of the content of this lecture, I've thought about his view of the body as far as we know it. We know that he became an ascetic and he starved himself. He fasted until it was right at the edge of death. I like the particular picture I'm showing here because it shows, the artist I think really captured it. It shows somebody who is fiercely fasting. There's no weakness in that image. It's fierce. He's fiercely doing it. And yet at the end of this, when he had brought himself to this point where he was near death, he had to face that it was failing. It had not produced for him enlightenment to do that. And after you've done something so difficult and brought yourself near to death, to have to turn around and face that it didn't work was very difficult. Very difficult. But he faced it. The rest of the story of his long life, he lived to be 80, we're told. The rest of his life, he made some form of adjustment in which he lived with his body. as far as we can tell, he did not use these very extreme ascetic practices to produce his insights and wisdoms. He lived a healthy body, as far as we know, until his death. And at his death, then I wanted to show the traditional view of the nirvana, peaceful, quiet. His body looks healthy. It's a nice way to think of the whole lifespan of this young man in the rainforest in the early days. The issues that we have before us today and the issues which he had before him, and the reason why we can at least look back and ask ourselves the question of what did he say that has any relevance to us today? One of those, of course, is something which has come to the fore in lots of ways, which is called animality. That we are living in a time when we have had to face the fact that as humans, we cannot exist in the world by ourselves. We cannot kill all the animals of the world and survive. We live in an animal world, and we are animals ourselves. And we have to remember that and to look back at ourselves within the context of animality and ask ourselves the ethical issues of how are we going to live with all the other animals in the earth, particularly since they are necessary for us to survive. We often forget that, but they are an essential part of the life that we have. The Buddhists have many wonderful stories about animality. One of them is the hungry tigress, very famous Jataka tale. Bodhisattva, that is the previous life of the Buddha, walking around, he sees a tigress who is in a pit. She can't get out. She's starving. She has a cub. He realizes she's going to eat it because she's starving. And he says, I must keep her from doing this. I'm going to put myself into the pit so she'll eat me and not the cub. His servant, we're told, became very concerned, and you can see in the picture he's running with his arms outstretched in horror because the Bodhisattva said to get him out of the way, I'm hungry, would you go get me some food? And so he got him away from there so that he could do the act of throwing himself into the pit. This tells us that when we begin to look at the body, can you just throw it away? Is that what he was saying when he did that? And I think this needs to be really looked at in terms of one of the most popular stories in Buddhism is this story. It is one story that appears in the artwork. It appears in sculptures. People were very taken by it. To some degree, it's based on another issue, which is the King Sibi Jataka. And this is a way for the Buddhists to say, this is the real question for all of us in the world. King Sibi is standing there, and this dove comes flying up to him and says, "Oh, King, I've heard that you're compassionate. I've heard that you have vowed to save all sentient beings. Here I am. Save me." "Of course," says the king. "Here, I embrace you. I'm going to save you. Don't worry." Well, then along comes the predator, the hawk, and says, "Aha, I see that you have compassion for a dove, but what about me? I have to have flesh, newly killed flesh, or I'll die. So are you going to condemn me to death by taking away my lunch and telling me to starve to death?" Do you only save one, but you can't save me? The dilemma was put to King Sibi in a very direct way. How do you choose who's going to live? How do you choose which one is worth saving? These are not old questions. These are really contemporary and pressing questions that I want to address a bit more as we go along. King Sibi has to make a decision. He says, I can't kill the hawk. I can't just support the dove. So what I'll do is, he says to the hawk, look, I will cut off my own flesh and give it to you rather than give you the dove. The hawk says, oh, sure, you say that, but it's going to hurt. You'll just carve off a tiny little bit of your skin. I want exactly the weight of the dove. So he says, okay, brain out the scales, as you see in this picture. Brain out the scale. You're going to cut off enough of your flesh to equal the weight of the dove, and then we'll be even. But of course, it's magic. He can never get enough. The dove gets heavier and heavier. He has to keep cutting off more and more because it is asking him to become totally involved in the act. He can't just do it a little bit. It is saying when we make a choice as to who lives and who dies, we can't just do it halfway. And we have to be personally involved in it. We really have to enter into this action. And we do it all the time in our societies because we do decide often who lives and who dies. And we have these decisions before us at all times. I face this. I live out in the country, and I have these beautiful little quail, these little birds, and they come in great flocks. And here comes a red-tailed hawk, and it dives down and picks one up. And I was always thinking, oh no, the hawk has gotten another one of them. Until I invited a friend who is a raptor expert. He studies raptors. He studies hawks. He said, when I do the autopsy on the hawks that we study, 50% of them die from starvation. They have a really tough life. It's hard for them to get enough to eat. So if you see one of them take a bird, they have to do it. You're going to have to restrain yourself from trying to cause the hawk to starve to death. So I felt as if when I look out my kitchen window, I'm reliving the King Sibi Jataka. There is this wretched hawk, and it's taking my quail. And I almost have to come to the place where I rejoice that it's done it because it's going to live. But one has to decide who's going to live. We know that the unintended consequences of how we make decisions, for example, if we kill all the wolves, then yes, we will get a lot more elk. The elk population will explode. But now we know if we take away all the predators, the prey will expand in huge numbers often, and it's terrible for them. They become sickly, they die from starvation too. There's not enough food for them. They get diseases. The whole thing of billions of years of natural predators taking and making choices, if we enter into that process, we are unable to control all the consequences of it. I certainly know that, again, from my house. I have a lot of deer. In fact, they eat my garden, so I sometimes get. But I also have a cougar. And the cougar takes a deer. and one was recently killed out just from our house. I talked to the ranger. And yet, without that balance, the deer population can expand to such a degree that they become really pitiful creatures. There's nothing for them to eat. They are unable to hold down their numbers. So, who lives and who dies? How do you make that decision? On one level, it seems it ought to be easy. Everybody, everything. But the Buddha understood that's not the way it is. That's not the answer to the question about the role of who is going to survive and who not. One of the things in Buddhism that I sometimes worry a little bit about is animal karma. The Buddhists seem to feel often that an animal has bad karma, that they were born an animal. I show here a banana slug. I had a monk from Bhutan visit me, and I took him for a walk in the woods. And there are a lot of banana slugs on the ground. He had never seen anything which he felt was a worse rebirth in his life. He looked at those banana slugs and he said, "This is terrible." And so for every banana slug, he did a ritual to give them a better rebirth. He stopped and said a prayer and blew on them to blow their rebirth into a better one. So we didn't get very far on the walk because there were a lot of banana slugs. He was very busy the whole day. Nothing else mattered. He saw this as a very negative thing. I think that you get two of these patterns going in Buddhism. You get the animality stories of how you take care and support, and you have the stories that the Buddha himself was an animal in his past lives many times. He was a deer, he was a lion, he was a rabbit, he was an animal. And then at the same time, you have the other story, which is that it's not good to be an animal. So we come to our human body. We are faced with the ethics for a new technology for preservation of the body. We are faced often these days with a real choice: who is to live? And I think that one of the things we have to realize is every single introduction of a new technology requires a new ethic. You cannot have a new technology without some ethical response to it. It's like the computer. Computer came along, we had no ethics for it. It's taking us a long time to try to develop an ethical position with regard to the computer. It's not all right to plant viruses in other people's computers. That's ethically wrong. We're now beginning to say that. We have had to develop a whole position to tell people what is it that makes it ethical. How about pornography? Or how about opening the computer to children? Do they see things which we wish they wouldn't see? What's the ethics behind it? How can we develop those ethical positions? It's going to take a while. You don't develop a new ethic to go with a new technology immediately. It takes you some time, and we have to have discourse, and we have to have arguments, and we have to figure out what works and what doesn't. In 1954, the world changed. For the first time, a human organ was transplanted, a kidney. At that time, the only way they knew to do it was to find twins, identical twins. Then because they were identical twins, it meant that there would not be the rejection of the organ. One of them needed a kidney, and they performed the operation, and it was successful. at that moment, the world changed. It said, we have the ability to take an organ from one person and put it into another person. And that can save the life of that person. So long as you've got two organs, that works fine. Kidneys work. Liver, much harder. In other words, in some cases, you can't do this without a dead person. You cannot have a heart-lung transplant unless you have a dead body, because you can't just give that. So with the transplant coming into such use, what we have now is the situation where we have to have a registration of everybody who wants an organ. And everybody who wants an organ is not going to get it. There are not enough available for all the people that need them. So if you're a doctor, you see, it puts you in a really bad position, because there comes a point where you have to decide who gets it and who doesn't. You have to set up some rules that say, you can have it because, and then there's a list of things. But they would probably look at me and say, I don't think so. You're over 80. It's a waste. We'll give it to somebody younger. Even though the rules are openly, hey, age should not make any difference. Anybody who needs it should get it. But it's not the case. With my HMO, there is a little list of 14 things the doctor looks at to decide what treatment to give you. And certain treatments you cannot have if you don't follow what those 14 items are. I didn't realize that. And finally, when I got a look at it, they don't show it to you. It's kind of behind the scenes. But they do have to make decisions. Where will we put our resources? Who gets treatment? How much money will we put into you? Are you worth it, is basically what they're saying, instead of saying, well, everybody is equal and everybody gets it. But I can tell you that basically that's no longer the case. The cost of, at least in the U.S., the cost of medical care is so huge, they have to make a decision. So let me tell you, when I go into a doctor's office, I am sprightly. I am very much there. I want to say, I think I'm worth it. You can treat me. But we have unintended consequences. Why is there such a big list waiting for organ transplants? Two things: airbags and helmets. Motorcycle helmets have cut the death rate of young people. That used to be the most promising organs to harvest. Young men on motorcycles who kill themselves. The doctors were waiting for them. Their organs were highly prized. And then suddenly they passed a law, and the law said you got to wear a helmet. They all put on their helmets, and they survived the crash. No organs. It's very interesting how you get an unexpected result. So you're saving one group of people by saying, we're going to put airbags and we're going to put helmets on you and you're going to live. However, this person over here who needs that organ transplant now can't live because you live. It's the irony of what we are faced with that are real issues, and we face them all the time. Heart transplants are the same way, although within 3 or 4 months, if you're desperate, you might get one. But the problem with that is that people who need a heart transplant often can't wait 3 or 4 months. They need it this afternoon. And so, again, we are faced with a decision on the part of somebody who's going to live and who's going to die. It's King Sibi. He's standing there looking at the hawk and dove and saying, which one of you lives? Which one do I give life to? How can I have both of you live? And it's very hard. Abortion is a big issue. It's the same issue in many ways. Sometimes it's a question of who lives. Does the mother live or does the baby live? The fetus. You are faced with the decision. And it's very often the decision. Just recently, I put it up here, this situation in Ireland where the young woman was not given help. They realized the fetus wasn't going to live, but the heart was still beating. So the law in Ireland said, you can't abort it. And she died before the baby did. In that sense, baby, of course, did die. So everybody's up in arms. How do you make a decision about who's going to live in this situation? What's more important? It is not an easy decision to make. Well, we're also now in the era of what is the nature of my body? We have to reevaluate what our bodies are. There's a total new paradigm, if you wish to use that word, about what a body is. And the body is mainly made up of things which are not our DNA. Our bodies are filled with microbes that are not us. They are separate creatures. But without them, we cannot live. Those microbes in our body, which we have been able to build up over time, are absolutely necessary for us to survive, and yet they are not us. Our body is filled with all of these foreign things. So when we think about our body as this is my body, in a way this is a carrying case for microbes. They live within this carrying case that I walk around with every day. And that when you read there are 10 times more bacteria than there are cells in the body, you realize we are filled with all this. Our bodies are simply, it's called the microbiome. We're just filled with other things. The Buddhists have no problem with this. They've always said all along, your body is just a composite. It's just a combination of a lot of things that are constantly changing. It's not a permanent, ongoing entity. The body that we have changes every minute. He mentioned to you that I teach in prisons. And one of the prisoners, because the prisoners are really interested in rebirth, particularly if they're in prison for life. Rebirth seems a big issue for them, and I understand that. It's a terrible situation that they're in. But one of them asked me, how can I believe in rebirth? Can you give me proof right here and there? That's why I like to teach prisoners. They have no filters. They go right at you. They ask you, should I trust you? Are you really good enough to teach me? It's very nice. I like it. Somebody can just ask you that. So when he asked that question, I decided to give him an answer, which was, in one way, if you want to think about it this way, and it's just another way of thinking, in one way, we get reborn every second, every millisecond. How is it that our body can change, and yet there is some passage from 1 millisecond to the other of all the things that we think of as being us? We've all changed since we came into the room. We have been reborn 1,000,000 times as we sit here. So we are faced with a body which changes all the time. We're faced with a body which is filled with all these things that are not us. We have to reevaluate our bodies and think about them in a totally different way. Of course, DNA has come to the fore. And when we look at the helix structure of a DNA, the question is, are we looking at karma? Is that what karma looks like? Is it the DNA that carries with it all of the things that come from the past and are going to be expressed in the future? A number of my colleagues in Buddhist Studies assure me karma is not DNA. I'll accept that. But I don't think that we can totally talk about DNA without thinking about karma. I think that it is totally tied together in many ways. How is it that we can have all of this information from the past, from the distant past? They can track my DNA back to Lucy, hundreds of thousand years ago, and it's still with me. I carry all that baggage with me. It's in my DNA. How are we to understand how this mechanism works? And I don't think the mechanics will answer it for us. I think we have to do a lot of interpretation. I think we have to think seriously about what happens when we have DNA. We're certainly moving where we're going to understand all the things that are in us in a very new way because we're getting so fast at it. That's why when they tried to find the DNA sequencing of HIV was early on. It took them 5 years to sequence it. When SARS struck, everybody was panicked, but within 31 days, they had done a sequencing of the DNA of SARS, and they could begin to respond to it. Today, they can take any virus and have a sequence within 8 to 24 hours. That's how fast we have come in terms of being able to understand and sequence the basic structures of our body. Cloning has come to the fore. Dolly the sheep, the first cloned mammal. And when that happened, then it brings up all kinds of issues which the Buddhists were also concerned with. What is it that makes the new life what it is? If you clone something, what have you done? What is it that makes that, does that break all the old patterns about karma? Does that break all the old ideas about who we are if I can be cloned? Well, of course, so far they've never been able to figure, they have not, at least as far as we know, cloned the human. But we begin to understand our bodies in terms of stem cells. And stem cell research brings up a lot of ethical issues because most of the stem cell research that's really good is done with aborted fetuses. And again, it's a question of who lives and who doesn't. If you use those stem cells, which are the best, they're not allowed in many places to use them. Stem cell research is definitely, in that sense, held back because they have to use a line of stem cells which is very limited. And yet, stem cell research in terms of our bodies and what we can do or how we might be able to help our bodies is again a situation of who gets to live. How do we deal with the fact that we know that a stem cell is like neutral? It can go 128 different ways. So that we can really begin to treat a lot of things if we figure out how to use the stem cell. But even if we do that, even if we learn, the ethical issues are still going to be before us. Doing anything brings up an ethical issue. We're never free of it. We are always faced with the other side and the questions. Amniocentesis. Pregnant woman gets some of the fluid removed from her womb, and they can tell her if the fetus has Down syndrome. She can then make a choice as to whether or not she wants to have that child. It's making choices. It is still making choices about who lives. How do we decide what's the best thing to do for that child or another child or for the mother or for the family? All of those are ethical issues that are now tied to biology. They are biological ethical issues. And so they affect us because they affect our bodies. And our bodies are being constantly reevaluated. They're now also doing a thing with the mitochondrial. I have trouble pronouncing that word. They can go into a cell. They can remove this. When they remove those little bits in the cell, it takes out all of your mother's DNA. And they can insert another woman's DNA into your cell. Why would you do that? Because if your mother has a hereditary disease and you don't want the child to have it, then you simply remove the mother's material from the cell and put some other female's material in there, and the issue is gone. I know about this. I have a thing called essential tremors. Sometimes my hands shake because my brain sends too many signals. It's familial. I inherited from my mother. If they had treated me when I was a single cell and they had taken her DNA out of that cell and put some other woman's in there, I wouldn't have it. Would I choose to do that? The answer is no. I love my mother. I'm really glad I have her DNA. I'm willing to tremble a little bit because I have it. So very annoying sometimes because you can't really read your own writing and things like that. But I try to think, well, it's a gift from my mother. I'll accept it. Again, how do you make a decision about your body? If you have the choice of what kind of body you have, which we now have, or what kind of body your child would have, and that you have the ability to remove something and put something else in, what's the ethical issues behind that? How do you make that decision? I think this is where we are really running into the whole issue of what is it that our body is. What is its history? What is the way in which it functions? What are the mechanisms by which it comes to us? How do we deal with those mechanisms? How do we live with this body? Do we make a decision not to live with it in one way. The other thing that's happening is brain research. The brain research has, for example, begun to show us that nowadays they are really learning a lot about how the brain works. And it's very interesting because you would think that's good, right? Good thing. We ought to know it. But part of that research is used for robotics. In other words, the more they learn about the way the brain works, they take that and directly apply it to what's sometimes called artificial intelligence, which is a bad word, but it's used. And so the drone technology is partly based on understanding how the brain makes decisions. And the brain research has produced this unexpected result. On the other hand, we have in our human-machine civilization, which we're all in, this human-machine civilization that we live in, we are all dependent on some form of machine activity. We've got we lose our arm, we put in a machine. And it works. The machine civilization and human issue in which we live is that we are allowing ourselves to constantly get more power because we learn how to use the machine. And no machine has been greater at this than the computer. And the computer extends our ability to do things far beyond what we once could do. And so we are living with machines. If all the computers went down in the world, nothing in your house would work. No refrigerator, no television, no cell phone, no electricity, no doorbell. It wouldn't work anymore because we live in a human-machine civilization. It's already with us. So from the Buddhist perspective, it's saying, we knew this all along. We are a composite of a lot of different things. And our composite changes every single moment. And so we have to learn how to live with a changing composite that we call a body. We have to learn to recognize that we can do certain things because of the conditions that we create through machines that we can do them. But the ethical issues behind them always stare us in the face. The ethical issues for all of this are very powerful. In the old days, there was a rule. You never teach a robot to kill a human. That was the rule. Robotics was never to do any program which would harm humans. We've dropped it. We are now using robotic war. We dropped that one issue, which was to say, if we're going to live in a machine-human civilization, then the machines have to be ethically controlled the same as the human body. And how do you do that? Very hard to do it. Ray Kurzweil, a futurist, he talks about what he calls that moment of singularity. The moment of singularity is borrowed from physics. The moment of singularity is, for him, the moment when humans transcend biology. When the human is able to overcome the biological issues of the body and what relates to the body. So that in this human-machine civilization in which we live, That moment of singularity is where, in a sense, the machine becomes more important in a way than the body, if that can happen. For Buddhism, these should be major issues. They are issues which they have discussed from the very beginning. The Jataka tale, which seems like a quaint little story about doves and hawks, has this extremely serious undertone of how do you make basic decisions about life and death? How do you decide how to live life with all those options that come before us? And how do we, as people who try our best, when we know that there are so many unforeseen results and consequences of our action? Who would think that I put a helmet on a young man who rides a motorcycle and I condemn somebody to death because they need a liver and they're not going to get it? Unintended consequences. Those unintended consequences overwhelm us sometimes. We have to be ready for them. We can't just say, hey, I can go from here straight to there and it's going to work. It won't. From here to there is filled with messy issues. It's filled with all kinds of dead ends and with circular activity. So, that young man in the rainforest, what does he have to say to me today? How could he possibly understand what I face with my computers, with my ability to deal with the minutest part of my body, with my ability to reconstruct the very building blocks of life of DNA? What would he have to say? And it seems to me that what he has, and the teaching that comes down from that tradition, is still very much with us and alive and well in a lot of ways. It says, look, you have to realize there's birth, there's death. You have to realize there's old age, there's illness, and there's death. You have to come to grips with the fact that life is challenging and sometimes dissatisfying, called suffering. Have to realize that we are always trying to be compassionate, and yet it's not enough just to be nice. It's not nice that's needed. Compassion has to be wisdom. If you don't have wisdom with your compassion, the passion is nothing. You can make terrible mistakes by being nice. You can be nice to your kids and give them a lot of money or give them whatever. But what they really want is your compassion and your wisdom. Everybody wants it. We want it from each other. We want to be able to say, just as the Buddha was, I think, said long ago, compassion is only what results after wisdom. That's how you know your wisdom is right, because you get compassionate. But you got the wisdom first. And we're not always wise. And we make terrible mistakes. At least I do. But I think that when I look back to the rainforest, I am still aware that those issues are with us today. There are the same issues that he talked about. We can go back and we can use the ancient lore if it has wisdom and it has compassion. We need those things. And sometimes the person that we mainly need to express those toward is ourselves. We really need to be compassionate to ourselves, I think. We need to understand how important it is to feel that we are self-preserving and self-supporting with compassion and with wisdom. Only if that happens, I think, are we able to begin to address all of these troubling and complex issues that are before us. So I like the newspaper account that said, for every problem, there is a short, simple answer that's wrong. We deal with a complex world, and that complexity is all the issues that we have to face because there is no easy yes-no answer. And that, I think, is part of the message that came to us from the rainforest. Thank you. I'd like to open it up, if you don't mind if I sit, for questions and comments, because that's more fun for me than continuing to bend your ear with my own talk.
Hello, Professor.
Hello.
You started a seminar with the talk of rainforest, and I would like to tell you a story about the monkeys living in the rainforest 10,000 years ago. So when the monkey, they were like dangling on the trees, and one day they discovered that they run out of the banana. So one of the wise monkey, he think that he harnessed the power of the use of fire, and he decided to burn the rice, which is actually food for the birds. And he ended up like feeding the whole monkey population. And these monkeys, they are our ancestors. So do you think that this action is itself ethical problem?
Of course.
Because he is killing the birds.
Every action has an ethical dimension.
Including this one,
Every
right?
action, that's why the Buddhists say, hey, you do something, it's going to have a result. Be aware of that. You can call it karma, you can call it what you like. You can do nothing that does not have a result. And that result can be with you for the rest of your life, and it can echo down through the centuries.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for a very insightful session. I don't know whether this question is related to what you said, but just a curiosity.
Sure.
When you look at the Eastern civilization, and most of the Buddhism has been followed here, and I come from India, so Hinduism is sort of in a way related, and when we look at the Western mind, and when they analyze, Buddhism and Hinduism, they feel that it creates a certain, passive acceptance of fate and karma, and therefore it sort of retards, human progress. Whereas the Western world has a different, way of life, which has sort of taken charge, is more action-oriented, and has therefore, led to great development. So, some of us feel a little conflicted and would like to hear your own views on this.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good point. The Buddhist teaching says whatever is well-spoken is the Dharma. What does well-spoken mean? It says if you describe what the case really is, that's the Dharma. That says that it is very crucial to be able to objectively say to yourself, what is the present situation for myself or for any of us? And if I understand what the present situation is, there are going to be lots of times where I have to accept that that's the way it is. I may not like it. I may not like it at all, in fact. I have to accept the fact that I have very little money. One part of me says, oh gosh, this is really not what I like. I would like to be rich. Well, I'm never going to be rich. And my ability to continue to live my life means whatever is the situation. For some people, it's their health. For some people, it's an issue of what they are obligated to do. If we can't accept the way things are, really are around us, then we can't make any solutions. And that's why a lot of people who go out and say, I'm going to make it the way I want it to be. I do a lot of work with engineers in the computer field, software people, and I can tell you that the one thing I will not do anymore is to let a software engineer develop my program. Because what is true for them is not true for me. I have to say, this is the situation for me, and you either have to come over and address my needs, or we can't work together. And I've had to say that strongly to a lot of people. And they say, but I know I can make you a beautiful program. Yes, and it's like making a bird cage and then we're going to go out and look for a bird to put in it. I already have my bird. I know what it needs. I want you to make my cage. That's very different than just saying, hey, I'm going to make the world a better place. Fine. How are you going to do that? You better not try to do it until you figure out exactly where the world is. Where is the world? What exactly is the situation? Now you can say that's passive, that's just saying, well, this is the way it is. I use the example of, I had this a couple of years ago, and I went shopping, I went in the store, I came out and had a flat tire. I hated it. Nothing worse. I wanted to drive away, I couldn't drive away. How do you deal with that situation? You cannot solve it until you decide, I have a flat tire. Period. End of discussion. Why it happened, who did it, what's going on, that's not the issue. The real issue is, I have a flat tire. I sometimes have to keep telling myself the same thing so that I don't wander off. I have to say to myself, this is the issue. It's not that. This is the issue. If you want to teach people, often that's the best way you can teach them. You have to repeat the same thing maybe 20 times to say, the issue is this. Don't let them take you off down that path. Say, no, the issue is this. This is what the situation is. Let's get that straight first. If you don't define a problem, you can't solve it because you'll never know when you have a solution. So when people say, well, passive acceptance, I don't see it as passive. I see it as very active. It is very active to say, I have a flat tire. I'm not going to throw a fit, but I have a flat tire. What am I going to do about it? I'm going to call the tow truck because I don't want to change the tire myself. That's what I'm going to do. And I start solving it. If I stand there and kick the car and fuss and fume for 15 minutes, I just delay the solution. You could say, but you're so passive about this flat tire. Come on. You're just standing there quietly accepting that you've got a flat tire. Why aren't you angry and throwing a fit? So a lot of people that I see who said, oh, the Buddhists are just passive acceptance of life. Those same people may not like it, but they're going to have to face the same life. They may not want to see it. They may struggle against it with all their might and main. They want to make it different than it is. They want to imagine another scenario. And a lot of times you simply have to say to them, sorry, I can't let you go over there and think that's the way things are. This is the way things are. I don't know if there was a movie, As Good as It Gets, very funny movie, but the poor woman who's working for this artist has to tell him that he's broke. He's going to have to move out of his apartment. He's lost his, he has a huge hospital bill because he was attacked, etc. She feels that the person who sends her in says, you need to write all this down on cards so that you stick to what is the case, because you're going to feel so sorry for him, you're going to try to sugarcoat it and say, well, there's a little problem with money. You need to tell him you're flat broke. You haven't a cent. But if you don't do that, you can't solve the problem. Hard as it is sometimes, you really has to address people and say, this is what the situation is. So I don't see it as passive. I see it as real honesty often. This is truly the way it is. Yes.
I'm very interested in hearing your work with the prisoners, and I would like to hear more of the challenges that you face. And also for some of the serious offenders, they probably will face life imprisonment and there will be absolutely no hope for them to get out of the system. What kind of, what are they looking for, and what can you offer them? I don't know, to ask you.
I'll try to answer a little bit, but if I may, I'd like to introduce somebody who's much better at answering it. Danny, do you mind if I introduce you? Danny Tam is here. He's the one who has gotten me into prison visitation. Danny runs a group called the International Bodhisattva Society in San Diego. For 18 years, he's gone every week to prisons to teach them how to meditate and to work with them. He has changed the lives of hundreds of prisoners. And if there is a bodhisattva, you've got one right here in the room. And I hope that all of you who are interested will talk to Danny, because he is a person who really knows. My own experience with the prison is this, though. And he always takes me. I go down to San Diego. We get up at 3 in the morning. We drive 3.5 hours out into the desert to the prisons. We teach for 6 hours, and then we drive 3.5 hours back to San Diego. And he does this every week for 18 years, the prisoners. My observation is those prisoners change so much from meditation that it is startling. It even startles the wardens. They show me something which all my research and work and reading the Buddhist texts really never got through to me, the power of meditation. It took those prisoners to prove it to me. I mean, the change is remarkable to me. And when I was last there, I've forgotten, we went about several weeks ago, and I just tried to get these prisoners to open up and talk. And it was really moving because they would say things like, what I did at the age of 16. I'm in here for 43 years because of what I did in a tenth of a second. They're not allowed to tell you what they did. Some of them hardly remember what they did. They are often guilt-ridden, what they've done to themselves, to their families, and to the families of other people. And yet, with all of that, when they meditate, they begin to realize that it is possible, in one sense, to change yourself and to become compassionate. What's remarkable to me is they begin to help other prisoners, and prisoners don't help each other. They don't like each other. They don't trust each other. They will tell you there are bad people in here. You don't have anything to do with them. And yet, when they do this practice, they start reaching out to each other. And you see the power of compassion. So, even though they're in for life, there's one who's in for life, and he finally came to the conclusion, he said, I've decided that I'm a prison bodhisattva. My karma is to be here for the rest of my life, but I can be a bodhisattva for the other people who are here. So he teaches other prisoners how to meditate. They are capable of this. It is not I don't know if you'd like to say something, Danny. Please.
Thank you, Officer. Thanks for a nice work. And I did it because I feel just like a part of the human, should do. So all my 18 years volunteer in the prison actually changed me. And right then I tried to change them. Yeah, I feel that I will never can change somebody else unless they are willing to. And I'm just be there to provide what I learned and share with them. And one thing I'm really opposed is the death penalty to the inmate, because everybody deserves a second chance. And also I experiencing a lot of innocent inmate in there, and because they are only the one of the victim themselves. So actually, when we set up a sangha in the prison, and we offer them the trust to each other, and also they earn the dignity back. So they are willing to change for sure. And so I would like to share more in the future with these ladies here.
Sure.
But now I just want to thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
He does a great job. Wonderful. Yes. Question here.
Professor, I'd like you to elaborate more about wisdom and compassion.
Yes.
At your earlier discussion, and I think also consider the title today's talk as the Buddhism and today's technology, it appears to me that there's no wisdom without compassion. They really, to me, is one and the same. Whereas in today's society, we consider very different extreme of human actions. And technology amplify and leverage human action and human wisdom. It appears the problem of technological and rapid changes is that our compassion doesn't grow with the rapid pace of so-called wisdomization. I'd like you to elaborate on that.
Well, thank you. It's my firm belief that compassion is built into us. We're hardwired for it. We don't always express it, but we are hardwired for it. Charles Peirce is one of America's 19th century person, but he was one of our greatest philosophers in my view. Charles Peirce lived through the Civil War in the U.S., and what he came out for the war was he said that he saw so many soldiers who would, if needed, risk their life without a single thought and race across and help somebody else. There was no thinking. It was just an impulse to help somebody. So he came to the conclusion, compassion is native to us. Waging war, you have to be trained. But that you have to teach people. It's not so much part of them. Wisdom. At least for me, I've spent so many years at UC Berkeley. I can tell you that there are a lot of smart people in the world, much smarter than I am. And what always amazed me about a lot of them was that they were idiots in other areas of their life. They were often like children, really strange in some ways, because I would always think to myself, if you become educated and you learn how to think and you learn how to analyze, shouldn't you be able to apply that to anything? Shouldn't you be able to deal with everyday life in the same way, with the same focus? And I found out that that's not the way it always is by any means. So, wisdom or being smart does not solve the world's problems often. The opposite. Even with the prisoners, I have sometimes felt when I've gone in there, they're too smart. They probably were smarter than their parents. They have conned people all their lives because they were smart enough to figure out how to do it. And it was destructive to them. They had no one who touched them at a certain point of their life to say, it's not enough to be smart. You got to be wise with your smartness. Don't throw it away. It's a great treasure, but you can squander it. So, at least for myself, if I really work at something and have what I think to be a new idea, when I'm thinking about what I've just learned, it almost brings tears to my eyes. I think, I really touched something that was good. That's what I should do. The compassion ought to which is hardwired in me, ought to rise to the surface. The worst possible compassion, though, is where you feel superior and you are condescending and help. I have been talking to some of the students in the chaplaincy program who are going to go to the prisons. I've been trying to tell them, if you go into these prisons with these people in the situation that they're in and give them any idea that you feel that you're better than they are, that you're smarter, that you're there to help them because they need you so much, if that's what you go in with, you won't help them. You've got to be able to approach people from the point of view of, what is the situation? Can I really look at you and see you? I need to see you. I need to see me. And if I really see you and I really see me, it's touching. Because we're all in the same boat. Those prisoners are not any different than I am. Younger, some of them are smarter. But I don't feel that we're different. I really don't. And I think that feeling of trying to understand that we humans live in this community of the world. And we're all faced with exactly the same issue. We're all faced with illness, old age, and death. We are faced with the ethical dilemma of, how do we decide who lives and who dies, and how do we decide what's good to do and what doesn't work? So wisdom is, I don't know where it comes from sometimes, but I think you can begin to know when you have had it and it's good. If you've got something where you feel, look at me, aren't I smart? I've just done something fantastic. Beware. You're in big trouble, probably.
You said earlier, if you could define something, say properly, you have karma. Then the question, what is wisdom? Are we defining wisdom wrong? That problem.
Well, I think wisdom has to always be as close as possible to being able to see what's going on.
So why we should talk about wisdom instead of talking about something else?
Well,
are in fact wisdom and compassion the same? If that's the case, let's face it.
Well, I think the processing of the brain has some divisions and some levels, and there are just like they're beginning to discover with the brain can do two things at the same time. It doesn't mean that the two things are necessarily identical. It says they can be correlated. They can occur simultaneously, perhaps. But
that's the way we look at it. We are human beings. We have many aspects of us, all identical and not all different.
Yes.
All at the same time. If we continue to look at wisdom and compassion as two separate actions, then maybe we'll never find it.
it may be it's a problem of language. That is, once we have a word, words, we then live by our words. So we've given these things two different words. And
so we are trapped in those two labels that we create.
Sometimes.
And therefore we can never find the right actions.
Well, I think that, yes, that can happen. It surely can. But I also feel that it's possible for it not to happen. And that's what I'm always trying to find for myself. Thank you, though. Good. Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. I know these words. It was similar to a question I was going to ask about between wisdom and compassion and ethics and decisions and choices. I mean, in this chaotic global world today, everyone talks about ethics. Everyone talks about wisdom. And then the cognitive scientists and then the affective and the emotions and everything gets very mixed up. Yeah. So, in your view, in terms of ethics, is the Buddhist ethics and other versions of ethics, perhaps like Confucian ethics or virtue ethics or Kantian ethics or etc., how would you describe this whole basket of words?
It's the same issue often in terms of what we think about for, say, religions. I often say to people, if you love one religion, I don't see how you can keep from loving them all, because they have so much in common in terms of how they talk about not lying, cheating, hurting, killing, etc. They all say that. People who are in them don't always do that, but the religions themselves have these. The complexity that we wake up to every morning, the complexity we wake up to is frightening sometimes. And we had a conference here on meditation, and one of the psychiatrists from Oxford said a very nice thing, which I've been doing ever since then. He said, whatever else you do, it's probably a very good idea, at least 3 times a day, to take 2 minutes, sit down, close your eyes, and just breathe. And reset the system a little bit. Because we get like this, and before we know it, we've lost our way because we're so... And he said, just take about 2 minutes, at least 3 times a day. The other thing I think with meditation is, I sometimes say it's a kind of mental vacuum. You want to free the mind of as much as possible for a little bit of time, so that the complexity is pushed to a marginal area and it allows you to have a clearer view for just a moment. And even that's worth it. That's why I think with meditation for prisoners, they've taught me, if they just do a little of that clearing, just putting it to one side and having a moment of insight. Maybe insight's better than wisdom even here. A moment of insight. So that's part of how we try to handle complexity to me is periodically you got to clear it away and try to figure out how to have a bit of a vacuum where you can have something new and something else emerge. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for your inspiring talk. And
yes.
I have a few questions about ethics. To me, ethics is majority view of an ethical issues in a specific time to a specific group of people, usually share the same culture. So my question is, would the change in technology or some form of life would change the ethic views? Just like if the technology of cloning is mature and we use the clones for organ transplant or some use them for some demeaning jobs or some dangerous jobs, and the value of life may be lost the values of life. if that's the case, the ethical views would change. Do you agree that the ethics is not general to all human beings in all times? And if that's the case, is there ultimate ethics that is true to all humans in every time? Yes.
I always worry about universals. When students talk to me about writing dissertations and they make universal statements, all Buddhists do something, I say to them, that's a dangerous sentence to make, because all I have to do to disprove you is to find one counterexample, and your whole argument is shot because you made a universal statement. And I think that that's true in ethics. If we make ethics universal, all you have to do is to find one counterexample. So if your ethic is that you don't want to kill, then I've tried to describe to you that ethically that's a very hard, there's no way to just say, I'm not going to ever kill, because you are. We're all going to kill something. We can say, oh, I'm a vegetarian, but we still, the way in which we drive our cars, you drive home and you clean off your windshield because you've killed butterflies and creatures. You just can't help it. You can't help it. So, universal ethics I'm worried about. I feel that the way in which we act ought to be really seen in terms of this moment, this time, this place. And that's really crucial, because if you have a template of a universal, then it sort of says, you don't have to think, you just do it. But in fact, we are faced every day with situations where we do have to make a decision. We do have to sometimes make hard decisions. And sometimes we have to make a decision of life and death. Yes.
That's exactly what I want to ask about this ethical dilemma that you just mentioned. We sometimes have to make decisions as a community or as a person as to who is going to live, who is going to die. We all participate in such decisions.
Yes, we
do. Now, my question is, you have given us a lot of examples of such ethical dilemmas. Can you share with us your thoughts as to how the Buddhist teaching can help us in solving and facing these ethical dilemmas, like deciding who to live to death? Can you specifically share your views with us?
I think I've been trying to say, first of all, to recognize what is the case. That is, you have to come, that's one of the things the Buddhists always are, I think, pushing people toward. What is the case right now that I'm faced with, or I've got to make this decision? I really have to learn how to be focused on what the definition of what's going on. If I don't know what's going on, then any decision I make is just the throw of the dice. So that's number one. How do you get to know what's going on? Periodically, that's why they say you've got to figure out some times where you clear your mind of everything and allow yourself to have those moments of clarity which come when you clean out everything for a little bit and simply allow things to come at you. One of the problems that we have is that we keep ourselves from seeing what's going on because we are diffusing it with being busy, going here, running there. We keep ourselves distracted as much as possible. And cities do this to us. City living, as you all know, you can be distracted 24 hours a day. you never have to worry about having something to entertain you and keep your brain working, because it's all around us all the time. So the Buddhist ideas of being able to free ourselves from the distractions through practice, to occasionally just open up a vacuum, to allow ourselves to see as much as possible just what's happening. And you have to practice it a little bit. You have to practice it a lot. How do you look at your present moment in this room and say, what's going on here for me? What's happening right this minute to me? What is it that's happening? And so the Buddhists are trying to say it's to be aware. And what that means is the meaning of the word Buddha. It says to wake up. Wake up is just to become aware. To come out of our fugue or come out of our trance-like state of distraction and say, wait a minute, what's happening? You know, you see people sometimes, they blink their eyes and they shake themselves and look around and say, just like they do when you wake up, what is happening? I know it sounds very simplistic, but it's not.
Yeah, but it's clear enough. I think because for the ethical dilemmas that you mentioned, in reality, ultimately, there is no right or wrong answer. Yeah. You can make one decision. It could be considered as right by some people. You can make another decision, could be considered right by other people. So what the Buddha was saying is, but what you were saying, in fact, is that so long as you are able to look at that question with clarity, apply your compassion, use your wisdom, then whatever decision you make is the right decision at that moment in time. Thank you.
It's as close as we can come. Yeah, I believe that. Thank you. That was a nice way to put it.
Thank you, Professor, for the interesting discourse. I have a very general question. We are living in a world that is filled with conflicts and disputes. I believe that you are of the view that the Buddhist way of thinking or philosophy will help to address the modern day's problem. But what I see, most Buddhists seem to be, very passive, not very proactive in discussing or participating in with the modern day's, problems. What would be your advice to them? Should they be more proactive, in involving in discussion of today's problems, whether it's political or economical?
I hope he doesn't mind. I'll refer back to Danny here. He was a Buddhist. He's made a decision about how to face a very practical problem, and particularly in the United States. Massive numbers of people in prison. People whose lives are ruined by what they have done, if you wish. How do you address that? People can do that, and people do that. So I'd love to have examples of people who have used their tradition in order to figure out there is something that I can do. I may not solve the whole of the world's problems. I can't do that. I may choose just one area to focus so that I can at least do that. And I understand, and it's true for almost every everybody in every religion, every culture, every nation of the world. There are a lot of people who just decide to step aside. In the sense, step aside means I'm not going to face all the world's problems. In fact, I'm not going to face any of them because it's too hard and it's unpleasant and I just don't want to think about it. I'm going to step aside and just not pay any attention to them. But of course you can't. Nobody can step aside. We are, all of us, involved. And even stepping aside, you are still contributing to whatever's going on. You're part of it. So I understand what you're asking. Why don't people who practice certain tradition, why don't they live up to it? Why don't they do what it teaches in a better way? For myself, I would say the first question is, how am I personally going to do this? How can I step up to the line? What's my decision about how to do that? I need to do that first. I can admire somebody that I feel has done it. And I have lots of people that I admire in the world. And there are times when I simply don't know how to step up to the line. I just don't know how to do it. And that's when I have to ask myself, well, what can you do? And sometimes it's very simple. I can be kinder to my wife. I can be more loving to my children. I can be open to my neighbor that I'm not sure I like. I have a lot of ways every day that I can practice it if I want to do it. You know, it's there for all of us. So you ask yourself the question, tomorrow morning, what is, I have a friend who says every morning before he gets out of bed, he says to himself, today I voluntarily vow to. And then he thinks of something he is going to do today. So I will voluntarily vow today, clean up my study. Whatever you want to say. But that very idea that you first in the morning say, today I voluntarily vow to do something, forces us all to begin to think, how can we live our lives in a somewhat different way? A thoughtful way. We're trying to think how we can do it. I think you had a question, sir.
The medical and biological discoveries that you described in the first half of your lecture, they are all about 50 to 60 years old now.
Yes.
And in the next 50 to 60 years, I think there's going to be considerably more progress. And with that, of course, the ethical dilemmas are going to become more and more complex, because the human being will have more power to control some of the processes that we are not able to control now. No? So in that extended kind of responsibility of moral dilemmas, and this is not particularly applicable to Buddhism, it applies to all the religions in the world. No? So maybe we are looking forward to some kind of increase in our own wisdom to better face this kind of dilemmas, or what? I mean, it's not a question anybody can answer as such, but it's a point worth contemplating, that as we keep on making this progress, and with that progress we'll equally hope that our moral progress gives pace with. Otherwise we are we will be in a terrible mess in the sense of how many, for example, hearts you want to replace or eyes you want to replace, or whose and how, and all. Those dilemmas are here even today, and they will multiply as we can apply to more and more people. That was my comment. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And as you say, it's impossible to make predictions where you know that you're going to go from one to many. It's always able to predict if you're going from many to one, but if you're going from one to many possibilities, you can never really predict. And I'm not sure that we need to predict, or even if in some sense, part of the joy of living is that we don't know what's happening tomorrow. If we did, think how boring it would be. Tomorrow is an unknown, and we're waiting for it to come at us. We don't know what it brings. And so I think that's the way people that's coming to say, what is the case? The case is, I don't know what tomorrow is for me. Not really.
You know, we already faced the problem of eugenics.
Yes.
And that problem hasn't gone away yet, and it's going to intensify further as we go along.
Yeah. No, I firmly agree with you that the complexity of the ethical issues grow. They become, and yet at the same time, when you look back, remarkably, they stay similar. That's why I brought up the Jataka tales. Who lives and who dies? It just doesn't go away. It gets maybe put into a whole different scenario and a new way of looking at it, yes. And we have to solve that scenario. We have to be right in that one. We can't pretend that we're living back in the description of the story, but in many ways, our human dilemmas are with us just by the nature of the way this whole thing works. And even as powerful as we think we are as humans, very often it's a very puny little blip in the endlessness of this universe. And we sometimes have to be a little bit less arrogant about how important we are, because we have to live with it all. And so just to close, and I think our time is up, thank you. I don't, as you know, I don't have the answer, but all I've tried to do today for you is to open up this whole issue of the fact that religions, and particularly Buddhism, I think, must address the issues of our time. And it must come to figure out what are the issues of our time. Because the issues of our time, while they may be timeless in one way, come at us in a completely new guise. And it's that new guise that comes at us that we don't know quite how to interpret sometimes. So I'm going to continue in the next two lectures just to try to continue, I guess, to come back to some of the same issues, to ask ourselves the question of how are we going in this new age of technology to live with it, and if possible, maybe even enjoy it. So, thank you very much. Nice to be with you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lancaster, for his inspiring lecture and sharing. And Professor Lancaster will give lectures again in the coming 2 weeks. The next lecture will be held on next Saturday. The theme is Buddhism, Higgs boson, and the search for cause. So don't miss it, and we hope to see you again next time. And please enjoy some light refreshment outside, and you can continue with your questions and discussion with our professor. Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you very much.